From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! The top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dianne Feinstein, is calling for the immediate postponement of the nomination proceedings of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh after a second woman has come forward alleging he sexually assaulted her. This comes as 1,000 alumni of the Maryland prep school Dr. Blasey Ford graduated from have signed a letter in support of her, saying they're grateful she came forward. We'll speak with Alexis Goldstein, who attended the high school Dr. Blasey Ford did and is spearheading the letter. We'll also speak with Professor Barbara Ransby, who launched a black feminist ad campaign in 1991 in support of Anita Hill called African American Women in Defense of Ourselves. This came after Hill was questioned by an all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee about her allegations Clarence Thomas sexually harassed her.
Now, in trying to determine whether you are telling falsehoods or not, I've got to determine what your motivation might be. Are you a scorned woman?
We'll also speak with Jody Jacobson, the editor-in-chief of Rewire. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, is calling for the immediate postponement of the nomination proceedings of Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh after a second woman came forward alleging sexual misconduct by the judge. A former classmate of Kavanaugh's at Yale University has accused him of exposing himself and thrusting his penis into her face during a college party in a dorm room. The woman, Deborah Ramirez, spoke on the record to the New Yorker magazine and is now calling on the FBI to investigate her allegations. Meanwhile, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has agreed to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday about her allegations. Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when she was 15 years old. Kavanaugh's denied both accusations. As part of his defense, Kavanaugh has given the Senate a copy of his calendar from the summer of 1982. When he was in high school, which does not show him attending any parties like the one described by Christine Blasey Ford. But Kavanaugh's own team acknowledged the newly unearthed calendar also does not disprove her allegations. On Friday, President Trump openly questioned Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's claim. He tweeted, "If the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities by either her or her loving parents," Trump tweeted. We'll have more on the Kavanaugh nomination after headlines. The Trump administration's announced a new crackdown on immigrants applying for green cards to live and work in the United States. Under the proposed new rules, applicants could be denied green cards if they've ever used public assistance, including food assistance or housing vouchers, or received discounted prescription drugs through Medicare Part D. The National Immigration Law Center slammed the proposed rule change, saying it would rig the nation's immigration system so green cards would only go to the highest bidder. The group said, quote, "This is a regulatory backdoor approach to separate more families." The mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, vowed to fight the rule change, saying hundreds of thousands of our neighbors may be unable to see their doctors, keep a roof over their heads, or afford a trip to the grocery store if they wish to remain in the United States. That is simply wrong and un-American, Mayor Garcetti said. The New York Times is reporting Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein suggested last year he secretly record President Trump in the White House to expose the turmoil inside the administration following Trump's firing of FBI Director James Comey. The Times also reports Rosenstein discussed recruiting cabinet members to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office for being unfit. Rosenstein, who oversees Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian meddling in the 2016 election, called the Times report inaccurate and factually incorrect. On Friday night, President Trump suggested there would be more firings at the Department of Justice, saying there's a, quote, lingering stench at the department. A number of unnamed sources say Rosenstein was kidding when he talked about recording Trump. In news from Iran, 29 people were killed and at least 70 wounded when 4 gunmen dressed in military uniform attacked a military parade in the southwestern city of Avaz Saturday. The dead included military personnel, civilians, and a journalist. ISIS and a Saudi-backed separatist group called Avaz National Resistance both claimed responsibility for the attack. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani placed blame on the United States and Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
The small puppet countries that we see in the region are backed by America, and the United States is provoking them and giving them the necessary capabilities to commit these crimes.
Tension between the United States and Iran is escalating ahead of this week's UN General Assembly, where both Rouhani and Trump will speak. On Wednesday, Trump is chairing a UN Security Council briefing on counterproliferation. He's expected to use the meeting to single out Iran. Meanwhile, one of Trump's top attorneys, Rudolph Giuliani, addressed an Iranian opposition group called the National Council of Resistance of Iran on Saturday. The group is tied to the MEK, which was once considered a terrorist organization by the United States. Giuliani openly backed the overthrow of the Iranian government.
We don't know when we're going to overthrow them. It could be in a few days, months, a couple of years, but it's going to happen. They are going to be overthrown.
In environmental news, the Waterkeeper Alliance is calling for more stringent national and state regulations on coal ash after a massive coal ash spill last week sent toxic waste into the Cape Fear River near Wilmington, North Carolina. The spill occurred after a dam was breached following Hurricane Florence. The storm caused several other coal ash spills in North Carolina. In news from Latin America, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has warned the Trump administration's preparing a, quote, series of actions in the coming days to increase pressure on the Venezuelan government. Pompeo said, quote, we're determined to ensure that the Venezuelan people get their say. Earlier this month, the New York Times revealed Trump administration officials held multiple secret meetings with rebel Venezuelan military officers last year to discuss possible plans to overthrow Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Pompeo's comment came just ahead of the annual UN General Assembly in New York. It remains unclear if Maduro will attend. President Trump will address the session today. In news from Europe, around 20,000 people marched in the Swiss capital of Bern on Saturday, demanding equal pay for women and protesting against discrimination. The protests came as the Swiss parliament is considering legislation to require all companies with more than 100 workers to analyze pay rates to ensure there's no discrimination between the salaries of men and women. Swiss protesters vowed more demonstrations if salary inequality continues.
I think the message is pretty clear. As long as we don't have salary equality, as long as no sanctions are being taken or no control made regarding salary equality, we will go out on the streets.
In Texas, Republican Senator Ted Cruz and his Democratic challenger, Congressman Beto O'Rourke, held their first debate on Friday and clashed on a number of issues, including criminal justice reform, President Trump, and immigration. Beto O'Rourke vowed to protect dreamers from deportation.
There is no better people than those of us here in this state, Republicans and Democrats, independents alike. The defining border experience, the defining immigrant experience in state, to rewrite our immigration laws in our own image, and to ensure that we begin by freeing dreamers from the fear of deportation, by making them U.S. citizens so they can contribute to their full potential, to the success not just of themselves and their families, but to this country.
Senator Ted Cruz vowed to do more to crack down on undocumented immigrants.
This issue presents a stark divide between Congressman O'Rourke and me. My views on immigration are simple, and I've summed them up many times in just 4 words. Legal, good, illegal, bad. I think the vast majority of Texans agree with that. I think when it comes to immigration, we need to do everything humanly possible to secure the border. That means building a wall. That means technology. That means infrastructure. That means boots on the ground.
And comedian Bill Cosby will be back in court today for the beginning of a 2-day sentencing hearing. He faces up to 30 years in prison. In April, a jury found Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constand, the former director of operations for the women's basketball team at Temple University. Constand is one of 60 women who have accused Cosby of sexual assaults dating back decades. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, is calling for the immediate postponement of the nomination proceedings of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh after a second woman has come forward alleging sexual assault by the judge. The former classmate of Kavanaugh's at Yale University has accused him of exposing himself and thrusting his penis into her face during a college party in a Yale dorm room. The woman, Deborah Ramirez, spoke on the record to the New Yorker magazine and is now calling on the FBI to investigate her allegations. The New Yorker revealed Republican Senate aides learned of Ramirez's allegations last week and responded by trying to quickly move Kavanaugh's nomination ahead before the allegations became public. This comes as Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has agreed to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It will be on Thursday about her allegations that Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when she was 15 years old and he 17. Kavanaugh has denied both accusations. On Friday, President Trump openly questioned Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's claim. He tweeted, "If the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities by either her or her loving parents." That's the president of the United States, President Trump, who himself has been accused by many women of sexually assaulting or harassing them. But more than 1,100 alumni of the Holton Arms School, the Maryland prep school that Blasey Ford graduated from in 1984, have signed a letter in support of her, saying they're grateful she came forward to tell her story. In a minute, we'll go to Washington, D.C. to speak with the person, Alexis Goldstein, Holman Arms alum, who spearheaded the letter. But first, we're joined here in New York by Jody Jacobson, president and editor-in-chief of Rewire. Her latest piece is headlined, "GOP Wants Aunt Lydia, an Attack Dog Staffer, to Question Dr. Blasey Ford." Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Jody. So, I mean, these revelations, these exposés, these allegations are coming out one after another. There's even a third. We'll talk about that in a moment. But talk about the latest New Yorker piece about the second woman who has come out after Dr. Blasey Ford accused Judge Kavanaugh of attempting to rape her.
So, as you mentioned earlier, Deborah Ramirez talked to both Jane Mayer and Ronan Farrow at the New Yorker, to tell them her story of having been at a party where there was a lot of drinking and where during that party she remembers having someone take down their pants, put their penis in her face, and force her to touch it. And she could not remember exactly. She had taken some time to talk with other people before she came forward to make sure that her memories coordinated, or not coordinated, but corroborated with theirs. And when she did come forward, she said that she remembered one flash of memory was that Brett Kavanaugh was pulling his pants up as he was laughing at her after having thrust his penis in her face. So, you know, here's another person who is coming forward into really a maelstrom of political debate around a man who has credible allegations from Dr. Blasey Ford, and the Senate GOP Judiciary Committee refuses to investigate either of these at this point. And I think it warrants an FBI investigation, because if you really want to know the truth, and I don't think the GOP does, then you would do an investigation before you seated a man on the highest court. If you made clear that sexual assault and sexual harassment were serious crimes that you took seriously, you would do an FBI investigation.
So Deborah Ramirez then went on to spend years working with assault victims,
yes,
with domestic violence survivors. She lives in Colorado. Also, like Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, very hesitant to come forward.
Very hesitant to come forward, as would anyone be, right? Because you're talking about a long time ago. You're talking about people who are very prominent in Washington circles, and you're also talking about an attack machine that has millions of dollars to put against you. We just saw last week that one of the GOP consultants, Garrett Ventry, who is associated with the firm that Ed Whelan is associated with, and he's the lawyer who last week floated this ridiculous theory that it was a doppelganger of Kavanaugh who actually attacked Dr. Blasey Ford. He floated that on Twitter and later apologized. This guy, Garrett Ventry, is associated with Ed Whelan and their firm, and he was found to have sexually harassed someone and was fired from his previous job.
And explain who he was working for. He was a consultant with the Senate Judiciary Committee.
He's a consultant with the Senate Judiciary Committee, working with the same PR firm, let's say, that swift-boated Kerry. And so there's a whole interconnected right-wing communications attack machine here. And Garrett Ventry had been himself fired from his previous job due to sexual harassment. So almost invariably, every time you overturn a rock, there's some guy associated with the White House and now with the Kavanaugh hearings who's been involved in sexual harassment.
And explain who Mike Davis is.
So Mike Davis, and I wrote about this in the piece that you referenced, Mike Davis is the chief counsel for the GOP, the Senate GOP Judiciary, for Grassley. And he was the guy who was being floated last week before a public hearing was agreed to, this idea that Chuck Grassley would have a quote-unquote fair, private questioning period with Christine Blasey Ford in California. He was going to send his staffers out there to interview her in private and then come back with, a judgment on whether or not she was saying something that was, saying whether or not she could be credible. So what he was doing effectively was suggesting he would send his chief counsel out to California to privately interview Dr. Blasey Ford and come back with whatever he decided. This is the guy that last week, at the same time that he was being floated as the person to interview her, tweeted, "Unfazed and determined, we will confirm Kavanaugh." So this is not an impartial person that they were sending out to question Dr. Ford. Again, if you want to know what happened, if you care about sexual assault and sexual harassment, you have an impartial hearing and an impartial investigation. And there's not a single shred of evidence that the GOP wants that impartial investigation.
And then Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, what she has agreed to and what the Senate Republican leadership, Senator Chuck Grassley and the other Republican senators, have not yet agreed to. She will be there with security. She doesn't want the man she alleges attempted to rape her, Brett Kavanaugh, in the room at any point with her. What hasn't been agreed to is who will question her. Right. She says she wants the senators to question her. This is a problem for the Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee. They are all male, and they don't want those optics. It is said that they want a female lawyer to question them.
Yeah.
And she is saying she does not accept that.
Right. Well, it's the constitutional duty of the senators on the Judiciary Committee to conduct the questioning. And the reason they don't want to be in front of the camera on this is because a couple of them are holdovers from the Anita Hill hearing, and they treated her very poorly, as you may well remember, and watching those tapes is gut-wrenching. So they don't want to be the public face, and they want to put what I would call an Aunt Lydia there, a woman who is meant to sort of, take on another woman in support of the patriarchy. And they think somehow, in some twisted analysis, that this makes them look better. It doesn't make them look better. It makes them look afraid.
We're going to go to a 30-second break, then come back, and we'll be joined by Alexis Goldstein. We have to hurry with her. She's racing to the Supreme Court. There will be major protests around the country today, a kind of walkout, and she will be protesting at the Supreme Court. Jody Jacobson will stay with us. She's president and editor-in-chief of Rewire, and we'll link to her piece, GOP wants Aunt Lydia, an attack dog staffer, to question Dr. Blasey Ford. Back in 30 seconds.
But you can't erase. It's the text in the middle of the night you didn't ask for. It could help your career, but at what cost? Are you holding back something that you're dying to say? Me too. Girl, I believe.
Good. No. I Believe You by Fletcher. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with the allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, as a second woman has come forward accusing him of sexual misconduct. Deborah Ramirez accusing Kavanaugh of exposing himself and thrusting his penis in her face during a college party in a Yale dorm room while they were both students at Yale. Ramirez speaking on the record to the New Yorker magazine in a piece that was just revealed last night, a piece by Jane Mayer and Ronan Farrow. Ramirez is now calling on the FBI to investigate her accusations. This comes as Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has agreed to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, about her allegations that Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when she was 15 and he 17 years old. More than 1,100 alumni of the Holton Arms School, the Maryland prep school that Blasey Ford graduated from in 1984, have signed a letter in support of her sexual assault claims against President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, saying they're grateful that she came forward to tell her story. In the letter, they write, "It demands a thorough and independent investigation before the Senate can reasonably vote on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to a lifetime seat on the nation's highest court. Dr. Blasey Ford's experience is all too consistent with stories we heard and lived while attending Holton. Many of us are survivors ourselves," they write. They delivered the letter last week to Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, who also graduated from Holton Arms School. For more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Alexis Goldstein, one of the Holton Arms alum who helped to organize this letter campaign to support Christine Blasey Ford. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Alexis. I know that you're racing off to the Supreme Court. Tell us about this letter that you spearheaded.
So I was a group of 6 women who attended Holton Arms, the class of 2005. 5 of them wrote the text of the letter very quickly. I was very impressed with them. And we as the Holton Arms community, a large number of us really wanted to say that we stood with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and that we recognize her bravery in coming forward. This is coming at great personal cost to her. As folks have seen reported, she's been forced to move out of her home. She's facing death threats. And I think those of us in the Holton Arms community who signed this letter really just wanted to say, Dr. Blasey Ford, we have your back, and we stand with you, and we believe you, and we know how incredibly difficult this is, and you are so brave, and we are here for you.
And explain what you're referring to in this letter when you talk about Holton Arms and the atmosphere at the time. Again, Judge Kavanaugh attended Georgetown Prep, which was a male prep school nearby.
So I think this what Dr. Blasey Ford describes resonates a lot with the Holton Arms community, but it's not just about the Holton Arms community. I think pretty much any woman in America, this probably resonates with them, with any person in America. Whether you're a survivor yourself, you probably know one, whether you know it or not. Sexual assault knows no political party. It's not just something that happens at prep schools. It happens everywhere. But just like, anywhere else or any other school, members of the Holton Arms community, some of us, unfortunately, are familiar with this. And so we know how difficult it is to come forward. We know how much bravery it took her. And so we really just wanted to stand with her to say, don't mess with her, and that we have her back. Now, Alexis, there was another letter that was just her graduating class, Christine Blasey's graduating class of 1984. That's right. The class of 1984 did their own separate letter. I believe there were 24 signers the last time I checked, but there might have been more since then. We linked to their letter on the website for our letter, which is standwithblaseyford.com. They did it independently, but we just asked permission to link to their letter. How did you deliver the letter to Congressmember Capito, who also went to your school? She's also an alum of Holton Arms. So we wanted to make sure that every alumna knew about this letter, that we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to sign. Julia Louis-Dreyfus is another alumna of Holton Arms who we invited to sign. She did sign. Christine Lagarde is an alumna of Holton Arms. We continue to invite her to sign. And Senator Capito is an alumna of Holton Arms. And we just wanted to make absolutely sure that she saw the letter and had an invitation to sign it. So we went to her office last Thursday and hand-delivered a letter to the front desk. Senator Capito was not in the office at the time, but we just encouraged her staff to pass it along. And if she or her staff would like to meet with us in the future to just hear our invitation personally, we would be happy to do that. But we just wanted to make absolutely sure that Senator Capito knew about the existence of the letter and invite her, like we invite every Holton Arms alumna, to consider signing. Sorry, Senator Capito, that's right. And has Senator Capito, what did she do with the letter? And has she responded to you all since? You are sister alum, after all. I don't know what the senator has done with the letter, but we've been in communication briefly with her staff. So at least one member of her staff knows, and the front desk, that they're aware of the letter, but we have not spoken to the senator. And why are you heading right away to the Supreme Court? Explain what's happening today in the United States. I mean, I think this is a moment to say that this is not 1991 and that survivors must be heard and they must be believed. And I just want to be there on the steps of the Supreme Court today personally to show my support for Dr. Blasey Ford and say that we have her back, to say that we have the back of all survivors. I think that this is an opportunity to do one better than what happened with the Anita Hill hearings in 1991, although, as was unfortunately mentioned earlier in your previous segment, there has not been an FBI investigation. That is one of the things that our letter calls for, is for there to be an FBI investigation. The Holton Arms alumni community wanted to echo Dr. Blasey Ford's call for an investigation, and I think, that is something that the Senate should do. So I just personally wanted to be there on the steps of the Supreme Court this morning to continue to stand with Dr. Blasey Ford and echo her call for an investigation. And Alexis, your response to Senator Dianne Feinstein now calling for a hold on the confirmation proceedings of Judge Kavanaugh, with the second person coming forward. Now, Michael Avenatti, the lawyer for Stormy Daniels, is alleging that there may be a third woman who will be coming forward. I mean, in our letter, we've always called for a thorough and independent investigation, and now, just as before, is as good of a time as any to do it. It seems right to me personally that we should slow down. There is no rush here. Let's do an investigation and let's air all of these stories, and let's let all of these survivors be heard and be believed. A lot is being talked about the atmosphere of these schools. We know about Mark Judge, who Dr. Christine Ford wanted to testify. She alleges he was the third person in the room at the time that she says that Kavanaugh attempted to rape her, and it was only when Judge jumped on top of the two of them and they tumbled to the floor that she was able to escape from underneath
Kavanaugh. As she said, he was holding her mouth, trying to prevent her from screaming. Kavanaugh was, and she was able to escape. But this book that he wrote about his high school years, about Georgetown Prep, that's called Wasted: Tales of a Gen X Drunk. The atmosphere they're describing, and then what we hear Deborah Ramirez in the latest New Yorker piece allege what happened to her not so long after, when Kavanaugh was 18 at Yale. Talk more about that.
I mean, I don't think any of this is unique to any one individual school. I don't think it's certainly not unique to Holton Arms. I mean, I can't really speak to Yale. I was not a student at Yale. But I think, unfortunately, sexual assault happens everywhere, and it's an issue that is deeply personal for a lot of folks. It's an issue that deserves serious consideration and to be taken seriously. And when survivors come forward, they're doing so at immense personal cost. And as we saw last week with the hashtag Why I Didn't Come Forward, I believe it was, there's a lot of reasons that women and other survivors don't come forward. And so I don't think that this is a problem that is specific to any one institution. I mean, underage drinking happens everywhere, all across the country. Excessive drinking happens everywhere, all across the country. And unfortunately, sexual assault happens everywhere. So I think this is a problem that we as a country need to think about and contend with. But again, the most important thing and the focus, I believe, of the Holton Arms community letter was just, Dr. Blasey Ford, we're here for you. We stand with you. We believe you. You need to be heard, and there needs to be a thorough and independent investigation.
Alexis, 1,100 women signed this letter. Talk about this number. What are the class sizes at Holton Arms?
So Holton Arms is a very small school. I would say the class size is about 80 to 100, and the farther you go back in time, the smaller those class sizes are. So 1,100 women on a letter is a very, very large chunk of our community. So this is not a small portion of our community. This is a very significant chunk. So it shows you just how large of a presence within the Holton Arms community there is, standing with Dr. Blasey Ford and saying we support you.
Alexis, I want to thank you for being with us. Who are the other people who will be in front of the Supreme Court today as you head off?
I believe there's a whole slew of different organizations, to be honest with you, Amy. I just saw this on Twitter, so I just wanted to be there in person with them and show my support. But it's multiple groups. I'm not sure of the name of all of them, but I believe.
Finally, Alexis, this is the 7th anniversary of Occupy, and you were very involved with Occupy Wall Street and really involved with giving economic analysis to the economic meltdown that took place in this country. I was wondering how you compare the Occupy movement to what we're seeing today, the whole Me Too movement around this country, and especially that is expressing support like your school has. And by the way, has the management of the school expressed support for Dr. Ford? But if you could compare the two.
Well, I will say briefly that the head of the Holton Arms School, Susanna Jones, did issue a statement saying that they were proud of Dr. Blasey Ford for coming forward. And then I was a part of Occupy, someone who worked on Wall Street. I had firsthand knowledge of what it was like to work on Wall Street. I worked on Wall Street for 7 years at Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and Deutsche Bank. And in some ways, I would guess that is the parallel that I would draw. The Me Too movement is about women and survivors with personal experience with sexual assault and telling their own stories and speaking their truth about what happened to them. And I suppose that, at least for me personally, is the main parallel. Is it's about folks with personal experience coming forward and saying, here is my truth. But I would say the other parallel, I suppose, is just people standing up and speaking their beliefs and trying to say, this is how we want to build a better world, whether it is a better world that has more economic fairness or a world without sexual assault.
Alexis Goldstein, thanks so much. Holton Arms School alum, who is one of the women who spearheaded a letter now signed by 1,100 Holton Arms School alum that went to West Virginia Senator Capito, who also is a Holton Arms School alum. We're going to turn back now to Jody Jacobson, and then we're going to turn to Professor Barbara Ramsby in Chicago, who is involved with support for Anita Hill in 1991. But Jody Jacobson, president and editor-in-chief of Rewire, there is so much to talk about here. So much news has come out. In the New Yorker piece that came out last night, that detailed the accusations of the second woman to say that Brett Kavanaugh, in his first year at Yale, sexually assaulted her, pushed his genitals in her face, humiliating her and assaulting her. In that same New Yorker piece is a quote from Mark Judge's ex-girlfriend, Elizabeth Rasor. I'm not sure, Razor. How do you pronounce her name? R-A-S-O-R. Now, Mark Judge was a friend of Kavanaugh. He wrote the book Wasted, about his high school years. In it, there is a person called Bartow Kavanaugh, which is clearly a thinly veiled reference to his friend. And the New Yorker piece quotes Mark Judge's ex-girlfriend, Elizabeth Rasor, saying Rasor recalled that Judge had told her ashamedly of an incident that involved him and other boys taking turns having sex with a drunk woman. Rasor said that Judge seemed to regard it as fully consensual. She said Judge did not name others involved in the incident, and she had no knowledge Kavanaugh participated, but Rasor was disturbed by the story and noted it undercut Judge's protestations about the sexual innocence of Georgetown Prep. Rasor stressed under normal circumstances I wouldn't reveal information that was told in confidence, but she said, I can't stand by and watch him lie.
Yeah, so Mark Judge and Brett Kavanaugh, I believe, are still friends. They've been friends for a very long time. Mark Judge has written prolifically, not just in the one book you mentioned, but in others, about how his alcoholism throughout his teen years and how wild his life was. He has refused to come and testify on the Senate Judiciary Committee. GOP has refused to subpoena him. Now, he's been identified by this woman in the New Yorker as having told her stories of what are effectively gang rapes, because as the story is told, they get a woman drunk and gang rape her. So I think this alone merits investigation, and I think it's part of the reason that Judge doesn't want to come before the committee, because he would be under oath and be questioned about these things. And he's got his own lengthy written record of all of these activities. I think also, you've got this hint by Michael Avenatti. It's not corroborated. I don't know whether or not he has actual evidence or he's sort of trying to get into the drama on this. I don't know, but
let me go into when you're talking
Yeah.
about Michael Avenatti.
Yeah.
This is very important. The lawyer for Stormy Daniels. This is the list of questions that Michael Avenatti says should be asked of Brett Kavanaugh, and these were released in a series of emails he had with the person you were talking about earlier, Mike Davis, the staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is what Michael Avenatti says should be asked of Judge Kavanaugh. 1, did you ever target one or more women for sex or rape at a house party? Did you ever assist Mark Judge or others in doing so? 2, did you ever attend any house party during which a woman was gang raped or used for sex by multiple men? 3, did you ever witness a line of men outside a bedroom at any house party where you understood a woman was in the bedroom being raped or taken advantage of? 4, did you ever participate in any sexual conduct with a woman at a house party whom you understood to be intoxicated or under the influence of drugs? And 5, did you ever communicate with Mark Judge or anyone else about your participation in a, quote, train involving intoxicated women? 6, did you ever object or attempt to prevent one or more men from participating in the rape or taking advantage of a woman at any house party?
Yes.
These are the questions Michael Avenatti says the senators must ask.
He's implying that he's got information about this. Again, it's uncorroborated. He hasn't brought forth any person, but it connects back to the story that Razor told in the New Yorker, and it also connects back to other pieces of the New Yorker story and other reporting around Kavanaugh at Yale. He was part of a fraternity that was known for very heavy drinking. It had a somewhat I won't repeat the name on TV, but its sort of colloquial name was very offensive to women. He's part of the fraternity that marched around saying yes, no means yes, and yes means anal, and used to walk around with a flag made of women's underwear and bras. So his life trajectory, at least
the all-male secret society, was truth and courage, and it was that T and C that was colloquially referred to it.
Yes.
Insult to women.
Yes. So again, there's sort of a bigger pattern here that if you were really interested in investigating, let's just remind ourselves that Brett Kavanaugh does not have a great deal of credibility anyway, because several people knowledgeable about his testimony on other issues have claimed that he perjured himself, like Lisa Graves, who was chief counsel during the time that he was at the White House in the Bush administration. He somehow pulled out calendars from high school this weekend, but couldn't find emails that he was copied on during his relationship with Judge Kaczynski, who was widely known for harassing women and sending pornographic material around to his clerks. So there are very selective memories going on here with, talk about selective memory. Brett Kavanaugh seems to have a very selective memory and only brings forth those things that seem to hold up his end of the story.
There is so much that continues to be revealed. I want to thank you, Jody, for coming in, especially our condolences on the death of your brother.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here in this difficult time. Jody Jacobson, President and Editor-in-Chief of Rewire. We will link to her latest piece. GOP wants Aunt Lydia, an attack dog staffer, to question Dr. Blasey Ford. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll be joined by Professor Ransby, Professor Barbara Ransby, who will talk about her role in gaining support, particularly of African-American women, for Anita Hill back during the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings. Stay with us.
Tree that primitively grows, and when we go to bed, scarecrows from the far east come to eat its tender fruits. And I've thought the best way to protect our tree is by building walls like unicorns in full glory and galore, and even stronger than the walls of Jericho. But glad then, my friend, that in a few we shall reap abundantly. What we always dreamt of having, enough of the starving. Just love.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. News that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford will testify Thursday about her sexual assault allegation against President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, has prompted many to warn senators not to repeat the same mistakes made during the confirmation process of Justice Clarence Thomas back in 1991, when Anita Hill was questioned by an all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee about her allegations that Thomas sexually harassed her when he was her supervisor. This is Republican Senator Hal Heflin questioning Anita Hill back in 1991.
Now, in trying to determine whether you are telling falsehoods or not, I've got to determine what your motivation might be. Are you a scorned woman?
Former Vice President Joe Biden has been sharply criticized for his role in questioning Anita Hill as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee back in 1991.
You tell the committee what was the most embarrassing of all the incidences that you have alleged?
I think the one that was the most embarrassing was his discussion of pornography involving these women with large breasts and engaged in a variety of sex with different people or animals. That was the thing that embarrassed me the most and made me feel the most humiliated.
So that was then Senator Biden questioning Anita Hill. She was also questioned by the late Senator Arlen Specter.
You testified this morning in response to Senator Biden that the most embarrassing question involved, this is not too bad, women's large breasts. That's a word we use all the time. That was the most embarrassing aspect of what Judge Thomas had said to you.
No, the most embarrassing aspect was his description of the acts of these individuals, these women.
In the weeks after that hearing, Black feminists organized a manifesto titled African American Women in Defense of Ourselves that was signed by nearly 1,600 women who raised $50,000 to publish it as an ad in the New York Times. It read in part, "We're particularly outraged by the racist and sexist treatment of Professor Anita Hill, an African-American woman who is maligned and castigated for daring to speak publicly of her own experience of sexual abuse. The malicious defamation of Professor Hill insulted all women of African descent and sent a dangerous message to any woman who might contemplate a sexual harassment complaint." That was 1991. Now, Anita Hill has issued a statement on the sexual allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, writing, quote, "Given the seriousness of these allegations, the government needs to find a fair and neutral way for complaints to be investigated. I have seen firsthand what happens when such a process is weaponized." In a moment, we're going to go to Chicago, where we're joined by Barbara Ransby, who was one of the initiators of African American Women in Defense of Ourselves in 1991. She's now a professor of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, author of the award-winning biography, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, and now a new book just out titled Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. We're going to go to break, and then we're going to come back.
Smiling faces, sometimes they don't tell the truth. Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Oh,
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a moment, we're going to go to Professor Barbara Ransby, involved with the Anita Hill hearing. But I wanted to go back to Jody Jacobson for a moment, president and editor-in-chief of Rewire.News. Her latest piece, GOP wants Aunt Lydia, an attack dog staffer, to question Dr. Blasey Ford. Again, just to refresh people's memory, if you haven't been up on the news all weekend, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford is a agreed to testify 10 o'clock Thursday morning, 10 Eastern Standard Time, before the Senate Judiciary Committee. But I wanted to ask you one last question. Rewire particularly focuses on reproductive rights. Yes. And I wanted to ask you, Jody, about what you see as the connection, about if you see there is a connection between, well, what Kavanaugh is being accused of, and also his views on issues like Roe v. Wade and what surprised many in his hearings, talking about contraceptives as drugs that induce abortions.
Right. So, as we all know at this point, it's been a project for 40 years of the far right to get rid of Roe v. Wade and to eliminate abortion in this country. And if you recall, Trump promised on the campaign trail to put judges on the court that would do that. And Kavanaugh has a very solid record of being against abortion rights. He was the sole judge that tried to stop a young girl from getting an abortion who was in an immigrant girl in custody. He was overridden, but he personally tried to stop that abortion from happening. He's very anti-choice, and he also repeated a right-wing talking point, which is that contraception, which prevents pregnancy, so it can't be an abortifacient because you can't have an abortion if you are not pregnant, that contraception is an abortifacient. And this is, the original fake news system is the right-wing anti-choice movement because they have used so much fake information. It's not science, it's fake information as a sort of counter to real science and evidence around abortion and contraception. And by repeating that trope, he shows exactly how little he knows and how ideological he is about what the CDC calls one of the greatest public health achievements of the past century, which is contraception. So he's very anti-choice and anti-contraception.
I'm going to go right now back to Chicago, where we have just hooked up by satellite historian Barbara Ransby. She is the person who helped to organize the letter the movement called African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, a proclamation that was published in the New York Times in November of 1991, reading, quote, "We're particularly outraged by the racist and sexist treatment of Professor Anita Hill, an African-American woman who was maligned and castigated for daring to speak publicly of her own experience of sexual abuse." We are joined by Professor Ransby now. If you can take us back to 1991, as we just heard Alexis Goldstein talking about organizing 1,100 women at Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's alma mater in high school, what you did back with Anita Hill and why you did it.
So in 1991, we, myself, Elsa Barkley Brown, and Deborah King, organized an ad campaign, and it was really in response to what you've already described as what we felt was the outrageous treatment of Dr. Hill before the Senate Judiciary Committee. We wanted to say we believed her. We also wanted to put her statement in a larger context of sexism and racism that black women experience. And we did this, before the internet. So we got letters. We had an 800 phone line. We really reached far and wide. And I think many people were watching the spectacle of those hearings and were outraged by it. And we wanted to give voice to that rage. We wanted to insert our voices as black feminists into a public discourse. And so we wanted to put the ad in the New York Times. We put it in several African-American newspapers as well. And then an organization called AWEDU, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, grew out of that and lasted for several years, engaged in various work around gender justice. I see a lot of similarities, with this case. There's some obvious differences. Christine Blasey Ford is alleging actual sexual assault. Anita Hill was alleging, and we believe her. I believe Christine Blasey Ford. But the difference between harassment and sexual assault is a significant one. The racial and class backgrounds of the accuser and the accused is different, and of course it's 27 years later. So all those things are part of my reaction to this, but despite Me Too, despite all of the heroic work of so many women organizers for so many years, patriarchy and misogyny are still very much alive and well, and we see it playing out in how these stories are being retold, but also in how the Republican senators are behaving with skepticism and concern more about optics than substance.
You know, people may not realize it was the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 that was led by Senator Joe Biden. It was a Democratic majority Senate Judiciary Committee. That the Republicans don't want to repeat the optics of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford pushing very hard to be questioned by the senators. All the current Republican senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee are white men. There are 4 Democratic women on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and of course it's Republican. But if you could talk about what Anita Hill was up against, they want a woman lawyer today to be the questioner of Dr. Ford, representing the Republicans.
Right. I mean, I think this is, as I said before, I think it's more a concern with the optics, which, in the case of Anita Hill was so powerful to have this panel of white men looking down upon her, asking her, intrusive, embarrassing, presumptuous questions, questioning if she was in her right mind later. I mean, a whole number of things. The woman, "Are you a woman scorned?" was probably the ultimate low point. But I also wanted to comment.
Hal Heflin.
Hal Heflin. But, Joe Biden, I think, has expressed some regret about how he handled the hearing. There were other witnesses who were standing ready to corroborate Anita Hill's allegations who were not allowed to testify, and I think that's something to consider as we're considering this case as well. Yeah, I mean, optics are a concern. I want to say, that it's outrageous what happened, what women are alleging happened 35 years ago at Georgetown Prep and more recently at Yale in terms of Kavanaugh. But what's also outrageous is the feigned disbelief of these senators. I don't think for 1 minute that they find it implausible that these kinds of things happen. They are so pervasive. 1 in 6 women experience some form of sexual assault. And so, I think, trying to create a scenario where they are not hovering above this woman, appearing to be interrogating her, I think that is a political move. It's an opportunistic move. They're concerned with the theatrics of this. But I also think, in their heart of hearts, they are as familiar as all of us are with these kinds of instances of sexual assault and sexual harassment, particularly privileged men being insulated from the consequences of their actions. So the outrage, the feigned disbelief, I think is also a part of the theatrics.
And very interestingly, Professor Ransby, you have several of the senators who were involved with questioning Anita Hill in 1991 who are on the committee today, namely Senator Grassley, also Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who asked Anita Hill what she had to gain by testifying against Clarence Thomas.
Right. Yeah, 27 years later, and I think it's 3 of them are still there. And some
Orrin
of the same
Hatch as well, who is saying no matter what happens, he believes Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I know, and what an outrageous thing to say. But also, the same kinds of questions are being asked. Why did she wait? Why didn't she report it right away? I mean, anyone remotely familiar with the pattern of sexual assault know how hard it is for women to come forward, for survivors to come forward. Many people simply swallow the pain. Many women are fearful of the consequences of coming forward. And if the senators were even slightly familiar with the literature on this, they would certainly know that. But that is an echo of 1991 as well.
Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has made very clear she wants the FBI to investigate, like what the I stands for in FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right. Anita Hill did have an FBI investigation, got one. It lasted for 3 days.
Right. I'm not a big fan of the FBI, but in this case, certainly, I think an FBI investigation is warranted. There was an FBI investigation with Anita Hill. I think Anita Hill made a very strong, persuasive, and credible argument and told a story that was very compelling in terms of what happened to her vis-a-vis Clarence Thomas. We believed her, and I think we've been borne out. But the other thing I want to say is that in this atmosphere of Donald Trump, I think that's another significant change when you have someone who is an admitted sexual predator in the White House. The Republican senators can tolerate Trump. They certainly are prepared to defend and tolerate the kinds of actions that Brett Kavanaugh
this is part one of our
alleged.
Discussion. Barbara Ransby has a new book out. It's called Making All Black Lives Matter. Barbara Ransby is a professor of women's studies and history at University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining.